All right, this video is going to accompany sections 1.1 and 1.2 in the first chapter of our OpenStax textbook. And so what I'm going to do is open up my PowerPoint presentation here, and we will start with a little lecture that should accompany this. Now this chapter entirely, and especially these first couple of bullet points here, are really providing an overview to the study of human anatomy and physiology, kind of covering, the big picture of what we're going to study this semester. And it tosses in some key terms, some vocabulary words you're going to want to get used to, and kind of tries to set the stage for how we're going to study this particular subject. So without further ado, let's jump into defining the words anatomy and physiology. And so if we begin with anatomy, whenever you hear the word anatomy or read it, I want you to immediately think structure. What can you see with your naked eye? And that either means, what you can see on the outside of a body, or if you were to cut it apart, what would you be able to see with your naked eye inside the body? In fact, the word anatomy comes from a Greek word that loosely translates into to cut apart. And you can think of anatomy two ways. You can either look at the macroscopic, that is what you can see with your naked eye without the aid of an instrument, and that would be, what we call gross anatomy. On the left-hand side of your slide here, you got the heart. And if you were to do a dissection and open up the chest of a human, you would see the heart pretty much in the shape that you're seeing right there. It's a model here, of course, but what we mean by, on the right-hand side, microscopic anatomy is if you were to take a little piece of this tissue, let's say cut in right here and take a little tiny bit of this muscle tissue, put it on a microscope slide and stain it, and look at it on a microscope, this is what you'd see here on the right-hand side. These are cardiac muscle cells. This is one from here over to there. That's the nucleus of the cell. There's a number of them in here. You can see all the little striations. We're going to learn about this later in the class. When we're studying microscopic anatomy, what we talk about is histology. So the term histological study or histology refers to microscopic anatomy. Of course, the things are obviously related. This stuff is what makes up this structure. So that's one way of thinking about anatomy. Another way is thinking about how you study it. You can either study it regionally within the body. So as an example, this is the abdominal region of a human body here, what we call the abdominal cavity. And within it, you see all kinds of organs. You've got the stomach here, the gallbladder here, that's the spleen up here. Here are the kidneys. This is the descending aorta here. This is the vena cava, bringing blood back to the heart. This is the large intestines, the small intestines, and so on. Anyway, together here in the abdominal cavity, these anatomical features will in some way relate to one another. So you can study it that way regionally, or you can pick any particular system, like on the right-hand side here, I've picked the nervous system, and you can study that systemically. So to say that if I'm studying the central nervous system, it's going to carry me across several different regions of the body. Here it's going to begin up in the cranial region, but it will also carry me down into the dorsal cavity of the body. And so it crosses many regions. So either we study it regionally or we study it systemically. Now let's switch our gear and look at physiology. So as much as anatomy is the structure of the body, what you can see, physiology is the function of the body, and usually has to be studied in the laboratory in some form or fashion. What we're really talking about are the chemical and physical processes that govern the function of the body's structures. So yes, you can see the heart, and you can even see the heart muscle on a slide, but what makes it contract? What makes the heart beat? That would be the physiology. And so here you see muscle contraction, digestion, nerve impulses, hormonal actions, etc. So there's some of the kinds of things we might study in physiology. We're actually going to study them in all of the body's systems. In general, we kind of focus on what is referred to as homeostasis. In each one of these cases, these processes are aimed towards the goal of achieving a steady internal state, a healthy state for the body, even as external conditions change around us. And so that homeostatic process or homeostasis is really kind of the heart of the study of physiology. And you're going to see that as we go through the semester. Now, one thing I want to say is that there's always this wonderful interplay between anatomy and physiology. And what we understand is that the structure of an organ often corresponds in a very direct way to its function. And I love the kidney. This is a cross section through the kidney, and it's just an exquisite example of how this structure matches the function. And we'll get a chance to talk about that later in the class, so I won't belabor that right now. But just the idea that as you go through this course, I want you to always remember that as you're studying physiological processes, they likely match in some way the structure that you're going to be studying in that same organ. So very important. Lastly, in these two little sections of the chapter, they talk about levels of organization. And this doesn't just apply to humans. This applies to any living organism. And I'm going to show you some slides here in a moment that kind of put this together. But if you take a look, the levels of organization, structural organization, begin with what I call this, or what are called the subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are the smallest of the units in our structural organization. When you put them together in some fixed pattern, what you get is an atom. An atom, represented by all of the elements like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. Those atoms then can be joined together or bonded together into molecules. You'll learn more about that in the same unit. And those are just combinations of specific atoms. I'll show you an example in a minute. Anyway, cells, which are the smallest independently functional unit in a living organism, are really just collections, very organized collections, of different kinds of molecules. And you're going to learn a lot about that in this class. But as we are stepping up through the structural complexity, when you look at a cell and ask how it functions, you really have to understand how the molecules, atoms, and even the subatomic particles are arranged so that you can really learn how cells function. So we'll see some of that this semester. Anyway, if you were to take a number of cells of the same type and put them together, what you get is a tissue. So for example, if you have a muscle cell or several muscle cells and put them together, you've got a muscle tissue. And these are put together to carry out a specific function. If you take many different tissue types, let's say like a nervous tissue type, a muscle tissue type, an epithelial tissue type, maybe a connective tissue type, you put them together, you can organize them into an organ. And organs are a collection of different tissue types that are put together to carry out a specific function. An organ like the heart, an organ like the stomach, etc. Okay? And then an organ system is a collection of several different organs that carry out a specific function. For example, you might think of the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine. All of those are different organs that are part of the same organ system, the digestive system. Okay? And then, of course, the last structural organization level is the organism itself. Once it is a collection of all of those organ systems. Let's just walk through it quickly. Here is an example of those subatomic particles in an atom. If you look in its nucleus, you'll find these three red pluses. Those are the protons. Also with these little gray circles, spheres in here, those are the neutrons. They make up the nucleus, most of the mass of the atom. And then orbiting around it are the electrons. Here are 3 electrons orbiting around the nucleus here. So that's an atom. If you were to put a number of those atoms together, you make a molecule. And just for fun, I chose the caffeine molecule because I consume a lot of that to stay awake and make these videos and do other things that I do. So this is a caffeine molecule, but what you can see here are a bunch of atoms joined together. Here's an oxygen atom with a carbon and a nitrogen, another carbon, another oxygen. And anyway, bringing all of these together forms a caffeine molecule. And of course, other molecules, water, oxygen, DNA. DNA is a molecule, a very large, complex molecule. And those things, of course, go up to make a cell. Here's a model or cartoon of an animal cell. We'll learn actually a lot about these features in the same unit here. So you'll get to learn some of these features and how they relate to human anatomy and physiology soon. But this is the smallest independently functional piece that we can call living. So cells, but they're a collection, of course, of different kinds of molecules. Eventually, you join those cell types together, and you get tissues. Here's a bunch of muscle cells. These are smooth muscle cells put together into smooth muscle tissue. These are skeletal muscle cells put together into skeletal muscle tissue. This is cardiac. Here is blood cells, all the same kind of cells put together. I don't know if you knew that or not, but blood is a tissue. That's a white blood cell right there in the middle. And then over here's another kind of tissue, epithelial tissues, and there's other types of tissues as well. But you can see it's a collection of similar kinds of cells joined together for a single function. Okay? And now, if you take those tissues and put a bunch of them together, you can get an organ. Here's the stomach. And if you carefully look at this, it's got epithelial tissues here, It's got connective tissue in here. It's got muscle tissue down here. It has lymphatic tissue here. It's got blood cells innervating this as well. So this is an organ with many tissues put together. And of course, the last step here is to take a look at the fact that this organ, the stomach we just looked at, is actually part of an organ system. Here's the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, the rectum. So all of these pieces together, in fact, all with accessory things like the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas right here. All of those pieces are part of the digestive system. So in collection, you see this sort of structural complexity going from subatomic particles all the way up to organ systems that eventually make up the shadow here of this organism. So anyway, that's what's meant by that structural complexity. Really important that as you're learning about any particular thing, you recognize that it's divisible. If we were taking a look at these small intestines, we could divide them down into, well, what tissues are there? What cell types are there? Within those cells, what are the molecules that are there? And eventually, what are the atoms that are there? So anyway, hope this was helpful, and that's it for this video.